Here we are for another round of the 70s versus the 90s, and Black History Month continues as we celebrate middle-aged black women in love when I put John Barry's Claudine against Kevin Rodney Sullivan's How Stella Got Her Groove Back. And this one was an interesting one to get through because there's a lot of different variations in play with these films. So let's just dive right on in to the nitty and the picky. First up, we have John Barry's Claudine. Now, the director John Barry was a victim of the Hollywood blacklist of the 1950s. He's what the inspiration was for the character that Robert De Niro plays in that film, Guilty by Suspicion. And also one of the many white directors to direct black films in the 1970s. Here we have Diane Carroll plays the titular character Claudine, and she's late 30s, a single mom. She's got 6 kids living in Harlem. She's on welfare and she's also got a job. So there's also that element of having to duck, the social worker lady, to hide all the shit that they got to prove that they ain't got shit so they can still be getting welfare and shit because you don't make enough money working a job. And she ends up falling in love with a garbage collector played by James Earl Jones, and they spark a whirlwind romance. A lot more nudity than I would expect, especially from James Earl Jones. I would never have thought I'd have seen James Earl Jones's ass in a movie, but I saw it plenty in Claudine. The soundtrack too is really good. The music is done by Gladys Knight and the Pips and Curtis Mayfield, but the thing about the music in it is even more heavy-handed than the melodrama that's in the film. The film, it centers around the romance between Diane Carroll and James Earl Jones, but it also deals with a lot of the stuff that black people were going through in the early 70s and stuff. Her oldest son is a revolutionary, and we see him get into some stuff here and there, and her daughter ends up pregnant, or one of her daughters ends up pregnant in the movie, the oldest one. And also having to deal with that kind of clash. The thing about this one is that Diane Carroll and James Earl Jones are both around the same age in the film, and so that's not the issue. The issue is more class struggle and family stuff, because her 6 kids definitely don't want somebody that's gonna break her heart around her, some piece of shit. But they end up starting to like him. But then of course he's got kids of his own that he's not taking care of, so then the court's coming after him for that shit, and he's kind of had it. He just wants to quit and just start a whole new life and all this shit. And so there's a lot of conflict going on in the film, and it's very heavy-handed at times, very overstated by the music in the movie. Like there's even one song, "Watch Out for the Welfare Man" and shit. So it's like at some points in time it just kind of gets laughable to how extreme they get. But Diane Carroll does give a really good performance, and James Earl Jones is really good in the film as well. But what gets me the most is the ending of the film, because they have a falling out and they reunite and they decide to get married. But like when they're getting married, the oldest son, who's a revolutionary, decides to like have a protest, lead some kind of march against the fucking welfare office, and then the cops are chasing them. They end up at the wedding, and everybody gets thrown in a fucking paddy wagon because they're all fighting with the cops and shit. And then like the whole family's in the paddy wagon being let off, and the credits start rolling. And then midway through the credits, they're all just walking down the street like nothing happened, one big happy family and shit. And so the ending doesn't make a whole lot of sense. There's a lot of noise going on where you could have just ended it on a high note and shit, but it kind of makes me wonder the difference between when a white man directs a black film as opposed to a black man who directs a black film. And that moves us forward to Kevin Rodney Sullivan's How Stella Got Her Groove Back, which centers around Angela Bassett, who plays Stella, who she's also a single mom, 40 years old. She only has one son, who's like early teenager and stuff. And but here's the difference too. Like she's actually got a really good job. She's like one of those finance brokers and stuff for some big name firm and shit. Because that was also a difference between the 70s and the 90s. In the 70s, you saw black people in movies. They usually didn't have really good jobs. They're like shitty jobs, barely making enough to scrape by. And in the 90s, you actually saw black people have really good jobs, professional lives, and all that kind of shit. And then, she all of a sudden, she's kind of, not necessarily at the end of a rope, but you know, she's kind of just disenchanted with life and shit. So she sees the ad for going to Jamaica and she decides, fuck it. She calls up her friend Delilah, played by Whoopi Goldberg, and says, fuck it, let's just go to Jamaica. So they go to Jamaica and they're just going to cut loose and shit, you know. And when Stella gets there, she's kind of uptight, you know. She just wants to run, read, and all that good shit. She ain't really looking for romance, but she ends up finding it when she runs into a 20-year-old dude played by Taye Diggs. And, you know, there's immediate electricity, even though, like, you know, she tries to kind of deflect it, but she can't help that pajama party and shit they go to and everything. And they end up fucking, and then, you know, but the age gap is the biggest thing, that the biggest conflict, you know. I mean, there's a 20-year age gap, but, you know, age is only a number as long as you're of the, at least the age of consent. You know, when you're a fucking adult, who really cares what the age gap is if you're in love, whatever the fuck. And the thing about it, the performances are really great in the film. Angela Bassett, one of the finest women of all time and a hell of an actress. Like, she gives a great performance because it's not overdone. You know, this is definitely a film that could be played for melodrama, but it's not, you know. And the Taye Diggs gets props. He's doing a Jamaican accent, but the beauty of his Jamaican accent is he's not overselling it. He's doing it just enough to make it work, you know, because a lot of times it's very easy, especially when you're doing a Jamaican accent, it has the tendency to get a little campy and shit, and he pulls it off perfectly. And of course, Whoopi Goldberg is phenomenal as the friend, and like Regina King is also in it. She's fucking hilarious. And of course, when she gets back to Jamaica, or when she gets back from Jamaica, you know, her life kind of starts unraveling. She loses her job, her best friend dies, but then, you know, Winston, the Taye Diggs character, comes back, you know, and then they start living together and shit. But of course, you know, friends and family always gonna give her shit because, you know, you're dating a younger dude and shit, you know, like, but, you know, it's kind of one of those things, just mind your own fucking business. Who really cares? The motherfuckers are in love and shit, you know, let them just have it. And, you know, for a film like this, it's real easy for it to get corny, you know. And you can kind of consider that ending corny because they do end up together, you know, and it even has that cliche fucking romance thing where they you know, she runs to the airport, you know, he decides that, you know, it's not going to work. So he's like, I'm going to go to medical school, and he's going to leave that night, and she meets him at the airport and tells him not to go and agrees to marry him and shit, and all hugging. And, you know, like I said, very cliched, but it's an ending that makes sense for the movie. I mean, you could have had it where they don't end up together, but, you know, you can clearly see that these two motherfuckers were in love, you know. And it's a very sexy movie, you know, a lot of steamy scenes and stuff. Like, I mean, when you got two fine motherfuckers fucking each other, you really can't go wrong with that. It's got a very good eclectic soundtrack, a mixture of like reggae and soul music and shit. And very well made, you know, it's not overstated, you know. There's not a lot of little, you know, let's just talk about every little drama, you know. That's why it comes into play where I think, you know, the difference between having a white director and a black director doing black films, you know, it has a tendency to show when a black person's directing it, usually it has a tendency to be more respectful to the material, you know. It's not really looking at it like a social case, so to speak. So that's why I think How Stella Got Her Groove Back is a lot better than Claudine, is because, you know, not just because you actually have a black director behind the in the director's chair, but also there's no melodrama in a film that could be chock full of fucking melodrama. You know, the acting is pretty solid, cut and dry. You know, you don't have like long, like you can honestly tell, like, you know, Angela Bassett and Taye Diggs are good enough actors that they can convey more emotion with their like facial expressions than they have to with some like heavy-handed ass monologue and shit. So this round clearly has to go to How Stella Got Her Groove Back because, like I said, Claudine's not a bad movie. It's just it's not a very like solid movie because it's all over the place. They add a lot of noise to it that I feel is unnecessary, you know, because, you know, you're trying to make a movie about a romance, but you're so hung up on all the other shit that's going on that it kind of gets in the way of that, you know. And they still end up together. I mean, honestly, that ending could be a lot more powerful too. In a lot of ways, that ending is more corny than how Stella got her groove back, because it doesn't go the full potential. Like, you could have had that oldest son get killed by the cops or some shit, or you could have had something that really like made you feel something at the end, instead of just like, oh, okay, we're gonna end it like some fucking silly ass made for TV movie or some shit. So, like I said, this round goes to how Stella got her groove back. You know, despite how corny that shit is, it's actually got real ass emotions in it. The acting is better, I believe. So, for anybody keeping score, that's 76-60. Man, the 90s are on a streak again. They're coming back. You know, they have a tendency to do that every once in a while. Right now, they're on a 3-film streak. And, you know, who knows? They could keep going. That lead continues to shrink for the 70s. Now they're only up by 16. So if I said anything wrong, anything you disagree with, feel free to eviscerate me in the comments. It's just one asshole's opinion. You'll see more of these Afrocentric matchups come up through Black History Month. You know, next Saturday's main event is Superfly versus New Jack City. And like any film professors that want to use this shit, feel free, but we got to talk compensation and shit like that. And also to all you film bros, if you don't know, now you motherfucking know. So stay tuned for more. This is the 70s versus the 90s.